Welcome to Part 2, Art of the Americas after 1300. We'll begin this talk in looking at the Inca civilization, which was a huge state in South America. In fact, it was one of the largest in the world around the year 1500. To get an idea of the size of it, consider that it covered most of modern Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, northern Chile, and stretched all the way into Argentina. So they had a big empire, but they managed it fairly well. One of the ways that they got through the empire was through a great series of roads, over 23,000 miles of roads. But I get ahead of myself. Let's talk for a moment about gold, shall we? What you're looking at are some examples of the fine craftsmanship of the goldsmiths of the Inca. Now, they had a very special place in society. They lived together in certain areas of the cities, and they were exempt from taxation. There's a saying in the Inca tradition that gold is the sweat of the sun and silver is the tears of the moon. That's kind of poetic, but it shows how they related to these fine metals. Of course, when the conquistadors came a little bit later, they didn't have quite the same view, and it didn't go so well for the Inca. Much as what happened with the Aztec, they rose to prominence, they had a rather vibrant empire, and then their fall was swift. Oh, but we were talking about the roads. Okay, here's something to think about. Over 23,000 miles of roads throughout the empire. And they were set up so that there were storehouses and guest houses about a day apart. Now, if you want to get a perspective of what is 23,000 miles of roads, I know that from my home to San Francisco on the interstate, 2,000 miles. So if you consider the whole, it's an incredible network of roads. Some of them were wide thoroughfares, but really they didn't need to be that wide because the people walked, and they brought their llamas along too to carry the heavy loads. They had stairs to go up steep hills, and they had a very distinctive kind of a rope bridge that we see here. And this is actually the last remaining rope bridge, Inca rope bridge, but these went across gullies. They spanned areas throughout the empire that couldn't be crossed any other way. And I can imagine there were times when that was a little treacherous. Can you imagine bringing your llama across, or maybe your two llama across these bridges? Would be a little frightening. Let's talk about Inca masonry. These people were master stonemasons. They built with dry stone. In other words, there were no mortars. They didn't use mortar. They didn't have, their tools were actually rather simple also. There was no metal tools, so they used basically these heavy stone hammers. They had two basic styles of stone crafting. One is the polygonal that you see on the left here. And that means the stones kind of pillowed out. So they had a little texture and character of the stone. On the right, you see the smooth surface stone, which was also characteristic of the style, and they had plenty of it. Now, some of these stones that they worked with were huge. They have found stones in ruins up to 27 feet tall that were built into these stone structures. That's about the height of a 3-story building, just to give you some perspective. Here's a stone wall. If you look closely at this wall, you can see how carefully the masons crafted and shaped the stone so that it would fit together with what we call a dry stack. No mason, no cement, nothing to glue it together. It just held its place and continues to hold its place all these years later. Now, the capital and the center of the empire was a city called Cusco. Cusco is still a city to this day. Now, they say that the original city was built on the shape of a puma. It was quite a beautiful city, and yet now you see the stone remains, and you also see the thriving modern city that exists in its place. they had an interesting tradition that when you came into Cusco, you had to bring something. You had to bring gold or silver or textiles, but you could not take it with you when you left. So all this wealth just kept coming into the city, making it ever grander of a city. So from here, Cusco, we're going to go to Machu Picchu, which is one of the greatest architectural ruins in the world. And this wall actually is from Machu Picchu. Here's one picture. It's at 9,000 feet in the Andes, and it's pretty much intact except for the thatch roofs that they used. What I've done here is I've collected 3 different pictures because I want you to get a feeling of the scope of this incredible ruin. Here's another. Machu Picchu again. What I'd like you to notice here are the terraces on the right. So we have the town, but then spreading out from the town, actually both on the right and the left, we'd have these extensive terraces, which were built really seemingly right on the cliffs, and where they would grow food and be able to navigate the mountains more easily. Here's one more view. I find this to be spectacular. If you look very closely, there are stairs right here that go down. And you can see below, this is not a road, this is a river. This was the home to the Inca ruler Pachacuti. And apparently he would come here when Cusco got too cold, when the conditions were too harsh, because it's actually a little bit lower in elevation than the city of Cusco. The whole city of Machu Picchu was designed with a very powerful aesthetic. They took care to feature the views. I mean, wherever you look, there's a view. Also, they chose stones that would reflect the shapes of the mountains. Overall, this is just one of the greatest architectural wonders in the world, and it's on near the top of my list of one I'd love to see. As we discussed in last week's chapter, the creation of elaborate and really quite beautiful textiles in the Andes Mountains dates back to 3000 BC. Now, when we get to the Inca people, by this time, textiles had taken a lot of status in society. So they were woven out of cotton and alpaca and vicuña, which is it's kind of like an alpaca or a llama. And these were considered to be very strong status symbols. Also, you know, the Inca did not have a written language. However, they used these kind of symbols, what's woven into this garment as we see here, to express things. Each of these little squares represents a small tunic, and each of them tells a story or has a meaning. You know, it's interesting that when the conquistadors came, the gold and silver made all the sense in the world to them. But they really had no interest in the textiles, while the Inca people felt that their textiles were fit for the gods. They would sometimes burn them as sacrificial offerings, or they would drape them around statues. Now, if you look at Inca people to this day, the creation of the textiles of the Andes Mountains is a unique and a beautiful art form. The Inca, as we already said, were master jewelers. They were master workers at gold and silver. But they had a little different attitude about it than the Spaniards who came in the 1500s. To the Inca people, textiles were sacred, silver and gold were sacred, but not from a monetary standpoint, but really because they represented the sun and the moon. And you could think about it. If the spiritual belief is such that the moon is made manifest in silver and the sun is made manifest in gold, then that would really be an inspiration for artists. Now, when the Spaniards arrived in the year 1532, I think they just saw money. But what they did was they pretty ruthlessly took all the gold and silver that they could find and melted it down so that they could have it as, blocks of gold and silver to take back home. This llama that we're looking at here is a rare artifact that has survived, and it survived because it was buried. It's from the 15th century, so it's from the 1400s, and it was buried as part of a burial offering. The Inca held the llama to be quite sacred, and they actually sacrificed a llama every morning in Cusco, their capital. Now, after the Spaniards arrived in the Americas, really the population declined dramatically because the native peoples had no immunity to smallpox and other diseases, and the Spaniards were quite ruthless. But what's amazing is that even though their population declined as much as 90%, these art forms remain. They're strong and they're thriving to this day. All we have to do is look for them. And I also love to see how modern art and more contemporary art is inspired by these past very solid aesthetic traditions. So let's move on up north and talk about the Native Americans of North America. Here we have several zones, such as the Eastern Woodlands, Great Plains, Southwest, California, Northwest Coast, etc. These are really just broad designations because within each of these different areas of the country, multiple societies with rather different customs and lifestyles thrived. In New York State, in that area of the country, we have the Iroquois, who formed strong alliances. They allied themselves with 5 tribes to form a confederacy. And the Huron and the Illinois people did the same thing. Now these people, they made their livelihood with hunting and gathering as well as agriculture. They would often plant their crops, go hunting, and come back. And you know, here's an interesting fact that's not in your book, that one of the most devastating things to the people of the Eastern Woodlands, it was, of course, it was disease and it was, European expansion. But what really got them was pigs. And you know, that's interesting because we're dealing with wild boars here in the Ozarks, fast forward to 2016. But the pigs would go through, and if you've ever seen what pigs do in a forest, they just kind of bulldoze their way right through it. And they ate the forage for the deer and the other animals that the people of the Eastern Woodlands really lived on. And that was one of the most devastating things, was the introduction of pigs. So there you go, there's a fun fact. Not on any test, but it's good to know. Let's see, we're going to talk about wampum. What? Wampum. That's a belt. Here's the belt. Now, these were used to keep records, and most of them really don't survive. You know, pretty much all of the, except for the Cherokee, who did develop a language, almost all of the other peoples of the North American continent did not have a written language, but they used these belts to record important historic days or experiences. And here these two people are kind of shaking hands in the middle of this belt. And it's a rare example of what we call a wampum belt. So let's talk for a moment about basketry. There's 3 major forms of basketry that were used by people really all across the North American continent. We have plaiting, which is like making braids of 3 or 4 strands. We have coiling, and we have twining. Now, I know from experience that these baskets take forever to weave, and they take a great amount of attention. I have a friend of mine who does weave traditional baskets, and she'll spend days and days on one small basket. This particular example is not from the Woodlands people, but is Pomo. It's from California, and it reflects their mythology, that the great ancestor delivered the sun to the people in a basket. And then when he saw what he had done, he thought, oh, that's not the right place, let me move it. So the sun in the basket kept moving to new locations across the sky. And this is what happens every day as the sun rises and sets. Another form of art that's quite lovely has to do with porcupine quills. So that was, in this instance, what we see is porcupine quills mixed with beadwork. Now, before the introduction of beads from Europe, which were highly prized, by the way, European beads were highly prized by pretty much people all across North America. Before the arrival of the beads, they used just the quills, the porcupine quills, as well as bird quills, and they would be dyed and woven, and this art is quite fragile, so not much of it has survived. In addition to the quill work, we have beadwork. And here we have more modern beads done with a more traditional pattern. So it was done in 1860. But these were really quite significant status symbols. And this was done by a Plains Indian. You can see the beautiful, colorful patterns on display here. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried working with seed beads, those little teeny beads. Again, this is a slow and laborious process. Well, let's talk about teepees. So these were the mobile homes, really, of the Plains people. And they were actually the property of the women. The women, it was their job to build the teepee, to put it up, to take it down. And they decorated the skins that went around the teepee also. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but they're really remarkable structures. You know, when it was cold, they would wrap blankets and skins around the inside, like around the bottom here, to keep the drafts out. And in the middle, which you can see right here, is the smoke hole. They would turn this flap so that it would be properly placed for the wind. And actually, they're not really that smoky. Most of the smoke goes right up and out the hole. The Native Americans of the Plains had really a quite elaborate tradition of painting. And here we have, and you can see this on page 851 in your book, we have an elaborately painted skin. This tells the story of a battle. And this particular painting was given to Lewis and Clark and taken back to Thomas Jefferson. And then he displayed it in his home, which maybe wasn't the original intention, but there you go. You know, what happened was the Plains people were pushed further and further west as the Europeans expanded into the United States. And there was one major event which really changed their lives, and that was the completing of the Transcontinental Railroad. And that happened in 1869. So when the East and the West were linked by the railroads, well then, you know, all the land in the middle became accessible. And the people who had made their home on it for generations innumerable were really driven to small reservations. I think this is a sad story that we all know well as the slaughter of the buffalo, which were shot out of the windows of trains, really just for sport. It's kind of hard to understand that today, but perhaps we can learn from it, or at least notice when that aspect of the human condition repeats itself. Now we're going to move on to Northwest tradition. And this is a house partition screen. You know, the Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest were really some of the wealthiest in the nation because they had abundant resources. They had the salmon, they had berries, they had all sorts of wild things that were growing. And they had developed ways to store them, the drying of the salmon. So what they had in their life cycle was they had the summertime, which was very busy, with very long days, maybe 3, 4, 5 hours of dark. And then in the wintertime, they would go into their great houses called long houses, and they would tell these elaborate stories and plays. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But here what we have is an entrance. It's a partition screen. So in the book, they don't use the term longhouses, but I do know that that's what the people, the Northwest Native American people, call them. So they're these very long, kind of rectangular structures, and within each structure, several family groups would live. And this is a partition, so this would be to help separate one family group from another. And it's a rather womb-like entrance, but they were designed that almost all of their doors you had to go low and to crawl through to get from one area to another. And that really marks a feeling of transition. I want you to notice this sort of ovoid shape. So it's not a square, it's not an oval, it's an ovoid. And that, as well as the linear nature, is something that is common with Northwest Indian art. In this tradition, the families were divided into clans, and the clans went back for generations. Each clan had an animal as a totem: bear, raven, etc. This is a bear house partition, so this was the clan of the bear people. Here we have a Chilkat blanket from the Tlingit people, and we discussed these blankets at the very beginning of the slideshow. Now, in the Northwest Native American tradition, these designs had great meaning, and they were repeated for generations to come. But the history of the blanket is perhaps even more wonderful. As I said in the very first slide, they actually wove these of cedar bark, and they had a way of treating the cedar bark that would make them so soft on the inside and completely rainproof on the outside, because you must remember that many of these people were living in the rainforest. For example, the Tlingit, they're from southeast Alaska, so that's not the snowy part, that's the rainy part. And yet they use this to their advantage by making best use of the rich summer resources and then going inside in winter for their elaborate festivals and potlatches. Now the potlatch involves, supposedly, you give away everything that you can. Basically, if you want to improve your status, you give more stuff away. Now that seemed crazy to the Europeans, and they actually made, laws and rules to stop the potlatch. But if you look at how it operated within the Native American society, it kept wealth from getting too specified. It took over the problem. It solved the problem of one person being very wealthy and another person having nothing. So if someone was very wealthy and they wanted to increase their status, they gave all the coolest stuff away. Now that seems totally counterintuitive, but it worked for generation upon generation upon generation. Now here we have the Kwakwaka Wako bird mask. That's fun to say. The language itself, I'll tell you, is really interesting because they do things with their tongue. For example, the word tlingit, which is not something familiar to our tongue. But the story of this mask is told in your textbook, and I'd like you to read that story. But I want to go a little bit further with that also. The story of this mask is on 854. But what I'd like you to know is that this was only one example. There was a rich tradition of theater in the Northwest tradition. And that's because, think about it, in the wintertime, long about from November to really the end of March, it just rains, and the days are long and foggy, and you can't really get out and do much. So that was a very special time of year for the people, and they would stay in, and they would have these elaborate stories and plays with their masks. And of course there was teaching and shamanic rites that went along with this. All right, so let's look at the last peoples we're going to look at with this slideshow, and that would be the Puebloans, or the Pueblo people. Now here we have Taos Pueblo. And I have been there, and it's, I think, one of the longest continually inhabited Native American settlements in the country. So what we have in the foreground is a woman making bread, but we also have a multi-story apartment complex which houses really a variety of people living in their traditional ways. And one of their traditional ways was this ceramics. This is Maria Montoya Martinez, and she was one of the people that was very responsible for popularizing the ceramics of the Southwest Native Americans. Her style is very distinctive. It's blackware. So what she's doing is she's using slip. If any of you have ever taken pottery, you take the clay and you mix it with water and you make a slip. And in this case, the slip has been burnished until it's shiny. And then the clay, also the buff of the clay, shines through. So in this tradition, really ceramics was traditionally the woman's work. But Maria's husband, until his death, he joined her to help with the firing and the creating of the work. And she became quite well known, and now her whole family works and still creates these pots. I believe she's from a different pueblo, not Taos. She's from, but she is from the same tradition. Let's talk about the Indian schools. There's a lot of the Indian schools that were not so great because they forced people, the young children, to leave their homes and to abandon their language. But some of them had a positive effect, as we shall see. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a sort of a celebration of some of the Native American culture. You could see that, you could think of it in that maybe some more progressive thinkers were looking at these traditions that were on the verge of extinction. So one of those such progressive thinkers was a woman named Dorothy Dunn, and she helped to found the Santa Fe Indian School. This was actually a school of the arts, and she taught her students to paint in this sort of mix of European tradition and the Native American tradition. What I'd like you to notice here is that it's not as modeled. It's not as finely rendered. There's not really the shadow and light that we see with the more European tradition. And yet the realism of it, the fact that you can actually read the forms, is something that is quite recognizable from the European tradition. There were artists like Gorman and several others that came after Dorothea Dunn taught at the Indian school, and they carried on this tradition, which is actually still quite strong to this day. When you think of Santa Fe, it's really a center for the arts in New Mexico, and it probably really got its origins, had its origins in the popular mind back in the founding of the Santa Fe Indian School. So now we'll wind up with fast forward to today. And there's a couple of examples in your book of modern Native American tradition, but I just want to look at this one. This is called The Spirit of Haida Gwaii, and it's from the Haida people. They're on Vancouver Island, although they do spread into Canada, the mainland, a little bit more, but that's their primary homeland, is the far side of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And here we see how this artist has made a beautiful piece. It's a wood piece that's been highly polished, and it's actually taking those traditions that we looked at when we looked at the blanket, at the bare house partition, and turned it into something both modern and recognizable. Now I want you to look at the hat. This is a traditional Northwest Native American hat, and they were woven, again, from cedar. They would keep the head completely dry, and they were fashioned such that the water would just drop off the outside. So the last thing we're going to look at is a work of architecture that's really relatively new, and that would be the National Museum of the American Indian that was opened in 2004. Now the museum itself took many, many years to design and to complete as they worked out a design that would be respectful of the tradition and that would also work with the site. This kind of amorphic organic shape really seems to serve the purpose. On the outside there's native plants that honor all of the different traditions. And on the inside, the light is such that it goes across the entryway. It's all been worked out very meticulously to offer this home that celebrates the Native American tradition of North America. So this concludes the slideshow on Art of the Americas, Part 2. As always, thank you so much for listening, and may you be inspired to continue this look at a vast, vast subject that we have only really been able to touch on here.